Samuel Halpern was born in 1888 in the Shtetl of Shtetl, which was 25 kilometers east of Vilnius, Lithuania. At that time, Lithuania was annexed by Russia. The Russian school system had a quota for Jewish students, and only one Jew from Shtetl was permitted to attend. Samuel Halpern was the Jew that was chosen. Samuel was therefore able to learn science and math, while the rest of the Jewish kids in the village learned only Talmud from the Shtetl's rabbis. The Russian army drafted 16-year-old boys to fight in their army. For a Jew to be in the Russian army was basically a death sentence. They were put on the front lines, had the worst duties, and were treated terribly. To escape serving in the Russian army, Jewish boys fled to America. Sam was given a ticket by a Jewish agency. He had no idea where he was going or what was in his future. While he was on the boat, he decided to change his name. Joshua Pitum was the name of a Jewish boy who lived in Shtetl. He decided the name Samuel Halpern was the most beautiful name in the world, so he changed his name upon arriving to America. In 1904, he arrived in New York. He got a job cutting clothing on the Lower East Side of New York City. For 5 years, Samuel worked for about 5 cents an hour making garments in a sweatshop. He worked 16-hour days and lived in a one-tenement room apartment with 8 other immigrants. 30 men on the floor shared one bathroom. He used to often tell the story on how he would walk an extra 3 miles to get his bread for a nickel cheaper. Workers with their meager wages were also required to purchase their own needles and thread and were locked inside the factory during work hours to prevent people from taking breaks. For 5 years, he slaved away until he saved up enough money to move to Holyoke, Massachusetts, where he set up a new business, a fruit stand. He would wake up at 3 every morning, drive 2 hours into Boston to pick up the fruit, and then drive the 2 hours back to Holyoke, Massachusetts to sell the fruit. In 1911, Samuel Halpern went to Boston to visit a family he knew from his shtetl in Lithuania. He was interested in a girl he knew from the shtetl, whose name was Miriam Zager. When he knocked on the door to visit Miriam, Liba, her younger sister, answered the door, and he fell head over heels for her. In 1914, they were married. In 1922, Estelle Halpern was born, who is my grandmother. In 1927, Samuel Halpern had grown his fruit business and made a lot of money. He wanted to go back to Lithuania to visit his family. After the Russian Revolution and World War I, Lithuania declared independence from Russia. Life became very hard for people in Shtetl. There was very little food and almost no jobs for the Jews. The government didn't allow for people to immigrate. When Samuel went to visit in 1927, he found his family living in horrible conditions and was not able to do anything about it. Lithuania would not let him convert his Western money so that he could not share his wealth with his family and help out, nor was he able to help them leave the country. He lived with the burden of not being able to help his family for the rest of his life. He was very discouraged when he returned to America. In 1929, the stock market crashed and he lost everything. He had to start over from scratch. He kept working to grow his fruit business, and at the same time, he was still trying to get his family out of Lithuania. The Russians took control of Lithuania in June of 1940, and in the summer of 1941, the Nazis marched in and killed all of his family. They made the Jews dig a large pit and then shot them. He thought all of his family had died, but in 1945, after the war ended, he learned that one of his nieces, Leah, was alive. Leah had married before the war, and her husband was killed at the Russian front, fighting the Germans. His last words to his best friend and fellow soldier were, "Find my wife and tell her that I love her." His friend went all the way to Uzbekistan, where Leah was living, and gave her the message, and the two of them ended up getting married. In 1967, Samuel Halpern had bribed Russian officials and got Leah a visa and plane ticket to Israel. On the day that she was planning to fly to Israel, the Six-Day War broke out. Samuel then had to go through the whole process again, and then in 1972 he was finally able to achieve his lifelong dream of getting a family member out of Russia to Israel. In 1992, my father was able to meet Leah in Israel. He was very grateful to Samuel Halpern for saving her life. Unfortunately, Leah died soon after the meeting. She had told my father the story of how she escaped the Nazis. In 1941, Leah, her sister, and her mother were in the Vilnius train station waiting for their train to take them to Russia. Her mother said she and Leah would be right back, and she told Leah to stay on the train no matter what. The mother and older sister did not make it to the train in time, and Leah was alone. That train was the last train out of Lithuania before the Nazis arrived and killed all the Jews. Samuel Halpern lived a good long life. He was the founder of a shul in Holyoke, Massachusetts called Sons of Zion. He was a frequent visitor to Israel and gave a lot of money to Israel. He instilled strong values to his children and grandchildren. He taught them to love and trust God, to learn Hebrew and Tanakh, to be generous and charitable to fellow Jews. His dream was that his descendants should build their own Jewish families with a connection to Israel and the Jewish people. He passed away in 1983 at the age of 95 years old. The Shtetl of Aukstadvaris, also known as Shtetl in Yiddish, was built on March 7, 1452, by the Great Duke of Lithuania. The ownership changed multiple times until in 1518 the local church was given all the estates, including the inns, 2 lakes, and the school. In the early 1700s, the shtetl went through great hardship, including a plague and a war with Sweden. A census showed that only 2 people survived, but by 1790 the Aukstadvaris population had risen to about 2,500 people, of which about 100 were Jews. In 1795, when a large portion of Lithuania was annexed by the Russian Empire, many schools, including the University of Vilnius and the schools in Aukstadvaris, were closed. In the early 1800s, Aukstadvaris was bought by a lawyer named Antanas Melikvis. When the Russian Tsar passed the laws that made it illegal to teach the Latin alphabet, many secret schools emerged. One of them was located in Aukstadvaris. In 1864, the regulations eased and public schools were created. In 1897, the Aukstadvaris Jewish population was 482, accounted for about 33% of the population. In Aukstadvaris, the market took place 5 times a year, and some Jews had private shops. During World War I, a big fire destroyed a lot of Aukstadvaris, and in 1915 the schools were closed. In 1918, when Lithuania declared independence, Aukstadvaris became an official town, including a post office, mills, an elementary school, and eventually the home of the agricultural school for women. In 1930, the population had grown to about 7,500 people, including 5,000 Lithuanians, 2,300 Jews, 150 Poles, 30 Russians, and 20 Germans. The town had 39 shops, including 10 butcher shops, 6 hotels, 2 mikvahs, 2 restaurants, 2 movie theaters, a credit union, mill, and blacksmith. In 1940, the USSR took over Aukstadvaris. When World War II began, the Nazis occupied the town. On July 12, 1941, the governor of Altus County, which Aukstadvaris was a part of, issued an order limiting the lives of Jews and eventually led to an order to kill all of the Jews and bury them in a mass grave. In 1944, Soviet troops liberated Aukstadvaris. In the meantime, a big fire had burned down 65% of the town. The property of Aukstadvaris became a farm, and in 1955, a tuberculosis hospital was created. Fishing became a part of society again, and in 1959, a small hydroelectric power station was created on the river Verkhney, which is still used today. My grandfather and grandmother were born and raised in Aukstadvaris. My grandfather was one of 13, and my grandmother was one of 7. My grandfather, Samuel Halpern, left in 1904. He was one of many Jewish boys who fled to America to avoid serving in the Russian army, which was a death sentence for a Jewish boy. In 2007, as a way to celebrate my mitzvah, I traveled to Aukstadvaris. 103 years after my great-grandfather left his shtetl, I was fortunate enough to find Ella, an 85-year-old woman whose father did business with Arya, my great-grandfather. She told me Arya was one of the lucky ones. He died of a heart attack the year before they rounded up the Jews and shot them in the fields. She showed me the location of my family home before the Nazis burned it down. She also guided us to the Jewish cemetery, headstones overgrown with a century of weeds, but I managed to find my great-grandmother's headstone. I hope one day to bring my children to see the shtetl. I want to continue to fulfill my great-grandfather's dream that his descendants should build strong Jewish families with a loving connection to Israel and the Jewish people.